So I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that Australia's oldest university is built on the lands of the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation. Is that the right way to you guys would mention it? And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you all are. In addition to acknowledging country, I'd also like to recognize the Triple Gem because I work in a center for research and engagement based on Buddhist values and wisdom. Hence, I would like to recognize the Triple Gem of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Together, they make up the lineage, philosophy, and community of Buddhism that the Humanistic Buddhism Center has embraced to deepen our engagement, reflection, and scholarly investigation. I want to thank Mark for giving me the opportunity to review what Humanistic Buddhism meant to me. So today's talk is both etic and emic. I want to bring in both points of view of what the research and the scholarship has been around Humanistic Buddhism, its roots in China, and its development. And I've also used this opportunity to kind of contextualize where the Humanistic Buddhism Center and the Humanistic Buddhism Program in Nantian Institute belongs. So therefore, I've come up with these 4 phases. And at the end of the presentation, I'd like to invite your comments as to whether these phases make sense. This is just Dreway speak. I'm open to any kind of feedback. Just tell me if they don't work. I'm also borrowing a horticultural metaphor of seeding, sprouting, flowering, and fruiting. And you'll see a little later on why I use that metaphor. I know that there's been also a lot of discussion in academia around whether this metaphor really works. So I'll invite your comments later as colleagues. So first thing first, I'd like to start with an introduction. And as us academics love to do, we love to give definitions and background. So I'll start with asking some questions around what Humanistic Buddhism is. And Humanistic Buddhism really has a Chinese origin. So why is that Chinese origin significant? And what is the modern world's? So I noticed there are a few chats. I'm just going to take a look to see if I'm missing anything. No, thank you so much for everybody online who tells me that you can see the screen. That's helpful. And I assume you all can hear me as well because nobody is screaming. So the first question, what is Humanistic Buddhism? Humanistic Buddhism is a translation of Chinese terms, 人间佛教, Buddhism for the human realm, and 人生佛教, Buddhism for human life. Alternatively, they are known by many other names, and one of which I think we commonly just say 人间 Buddhism. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to stick to Humanistic Buddhism since the title of the presentation given to me is about Humanistic Buddhism. I asked Dali to generate a picture of Humanistic Buddhism, and this is what Dali gave me. I think that's pretty good. What do you think? So what Dali says is that it has generated Buddhism for the human realm. So you see mainly humans with here on earth, human figures encircling the Buddha, a serene Buddha. And the figures are engaged in acts of kindness. If you look closely, they're doing kind acts for others. And this composition emphasizes also the integration of the Buddhist teachings, as in all the various Buddhist symbols, into everyday life. Therefore, the fostering of compassion and ethical living. So, and the theme, you notice, is Chinese. So Dali is pretty good. I'm impressed. For those of you who may not be aware, Dali is a generative AI image generator. And you can ask it to generate anything. So I just put in Humanistic Buddhism, and that was what it gave me. The term Humanistic Buddhism, though, is somewhat of a conundrum when I first encountered it. Well, first of all, I had some misgivings around the word humanistic because it reminds me of the humanism of the European Renaissance, and that's not what Humanistic Buddhism is about. There is a lot about Chinese Buddhist modernism, and that's what we want to bring in. So when I first encountered this term over 20 years ago, when I joined for Guangshan, a group of us wanted to say, let's think of a different term. And up to now, we couldn't think of a better term. So we are now stuck with it because all the other organizations have also started using this term. So here we are, humanistic Buddhism. So the meaning of humanistic Buddhism could have a descriptive side and a normative side. So a descriptive side is like Buddhism in the human world, in the human realm. Here we are. So it emphasizes the fact that the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha exist, or at least originated in the human realm. Then there's the normative side about Buddhism for the human world. So the engaged part of humanistic Buddhism, inviting lots of volunteers to come in. And it emphasizes novelty, ways to engage with the public and serve people, often borrowing from models of secular society. Okay. So, the Chinese origin. Why is the Chinese origin of humanistic Buddhism significant when we deal with other contemporary practice? So, here are some thoughts. You know that Buddhism was made and bred in India, and then when it moved and made its way into China, there was a lot of syncretism taking place. So the Buddhism that we see in China today is very different from the Indian Buddhism of the past. So the syncretism really took place quite successfully on Chinese soil, so much so that it's considered one of the three major religions of China. In fact, some Chinese think or thought that Buddhism was native to China. That was how successful it was. And so I see humanistic Buddhism as an ongoing integration of Buddhist values and wisdom together into daily life. Okay, so the Chinese roots, the Chinese ability to syncretize and making pragmatic relevance is important. Another is a fair bit of what has been said, many of the teachings of humanistic Buddhism relates very much to the Confucian ideal of social responsibility. If we have time, we'll deal with it a little bit later on. And the third part is that the spread of humanistic Buddhism around the world today, in a large manner, is brought about because of the Chinese diaspora. So the Chinese origin, therefore, cannot be removed from humanistic Buddhism. In the title of the talk, it's called Integrating Compassion Engagement in the Modern World. Now, again, modern world needs definition. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm looking at the modern world when humanistic Buddhism came about. So we're looking at the late 19th century, the 20th century, and now, this part of the 21st century, and not the modern world that we know from European definition starting from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment era. Okay, so let me clarify. That's the modern world that we are really looking at, the past 200 years or so. So that serves as my introduction, and now I'd like to move on into the different phases. So I'm just going to be very brief around many of these phases. I'll leave, if there's time later, for questions and answers if you feel that some things need more elaboration. So two main questions I'd like to deal with in this phase is really, what is the context for humanistic Buddhism to arise? And second, who the key pioneering figures are. Because of the limitation of time, and so that I don't bore everyone, I will only highlight two persons in this first phase, but there are many figures who have made humanistic Buddhism possible during this early phase. So I'll divide the making of humanistic Buddhism in the early days into two parts, the external context and the internal context. But before I begin, I just want to emphasize that there's a lack of consensus on when and why humanistic Buddhism actually started. And to note also that humanistic Buddhism is only one of various Buddhist responses to the socio-economic and political changes during the early periods, which is towards the end of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where there's lots of social political unrest that results from the Opium Wars, the presence of the Western hegemonic forces indirectly leading to the Taiping Rebellion. There was lots of colonialism and Western ideologies entering the land of China. There's a lot of aggressive proselytization by the Christians, and of course, science. Everybody was worshipping science as well. Then there were government policies whereby the Buddhist monastics were judged largely incapable of economic contribution. And as a result, many of the temple properties were confiscated. Temples were turned into schools. So there was this major, I guess, negative influences on the development of Buddhism. So there was civil wars, there was Christian domination, there was a repositioning of Buddhism that needed to take place. So therefore, Buddhism at the time was looking for answers. But internally, though, there were also some problems. There were some negative or rather criticisms that the average monk had very little education and therefore they couldn't do anything more than funerary rites. So most of the monks were involved in just rituals, and they were all in the mountains, far away from society. So therefore there was a need to bring out a new form of response to the era of that time. So the Buddhist responses, there were various, and they could be roughly divided in 2 areas. One is the rededication to ancient spiritual patterns. So there was a group of people like Master Hong Yi and others who looked at how the ancients returning back to the roots of the practice, usually Pure Land, and the others said, no, that we should be reforming. So now I want to look at the reform side. I want to highlight 2 figures. One who is very often associated with humanistic Buddhism, and that's Master Tai Shi, he who aligned or he created a form of Buddhism to realign to the Kuomingban's, which is the ruling party of the time, 3 principles of the people, 三民主义. And the response is 3 principles of the Buddha. The principle of the Sangha, which is to reform monastic education, for the Sangha to create or rather develop and groom Sangha who are more of a, who can be more of a counselor to the government officials. The principle of Buddhification, which is to emphasize compassionate social service. And then the principle for the Buddha land. The Buddha land is to restructure the different sectors of the public domain. So in the process of creating this new Chinese nation, which is the Republican era, we talk about a Buddha land principle, that this is the new Buddha land. And Tai Shi also made attempts at globalization. He felt that the Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva ideal, was an Asian gift to the rest of the world of the time. And in fact, Tai Shi influenced the rise of engaged Buddhism in Vietnam as well. Another figure that was important is Tzu Hang. So Tzu Hang's arguments also resonated with Tai Shi. He too believed that we should catch up with the times that we live in, and that we have to become a critical phase, and that this critical phase of society is when Buddhism's voice had to be heard. So he positioned humanistic Buddhism as the means to rescue the nation. So remember that, okay? In the early days, humanistic Buddhism was so engaged with the political era of the time. That was to rescue the nation by educating monks to offer civic and spiritual guidance to the officers who are making the new China, and education to serve a societal function as well. And he was also very active in charity and culture. So you notice that these are some of the themes. For those online who are familiar with more humanistic Buddhist groups in today's society, you see some resemblances, and you now know where those roots came from. The second phase is the sprouting of humanistic Buddhism now beyond China. So as we know, there was a civil war, so some monks left the country. Ci Hang, the last person I spoke about, was one of those. So one of them, so who are the main figures? I like to look at two persons, one within China and one in Southeast Asia. So within Taiwan. So going to Taiwan is this person called Yin Shun. Yin Shun is a very senior and well-established scholar monk, very well known. And he was a recognized heir of Master Tai Shi, whom we talked about earlier. He redefined and insisted 人间佛教, humanistic Buddhism, as the true essence of Buddhism, rooted in Shakyamuni's teaching. So it's back to the original teachings. And he emphasized the Mahayana Bodhisattva practice. And he said about the threefold mind of a Bodhisattva. And they are a Bodhi mind, a great compassionate mind, and the realization of empty nature of phenomenon. So these are his teachings. His major contribution was Sangha education. He looked for ways to improve monks and nuns' learning and training. So you notice now they're broadening from just monks to nuns' education as well. He has established various Buddhist academies, Buddhist colleges, and programs in Taiwan. Very scholarly monk who has written exegeses that are very well read in Buddhist colleges, not only within Taiwan, but around the world. Yan Pei is another well-known master in humanistic Buddhism, and he transmitted 人间佛教, humanistic Buddhism, to Southeast Asia. What he did was he tried to look for this pure land on earth and integrate it with the Confucian great unity. So you look at the parallels again, trying to integrate Confucian teachings, Chinese roots, with this pure land on earth, but now not within China, but out of China in Southeast Asia. He promoted Vimalakirti Sutra, which is very significant because it's a sutra about lay practice, lay bodhisattva practice, as the practice of humanistic Buddhists. He encouraged civic engagement, and he encouraged the Buddhisms of the people. So it's a humanistic Buddhism, the Buddhism of the peoples, the Buddhism that benefits people, the Buddhism that reaches people through various media. Again, you see, we start to recognize signs of the kind of Buddhism that we recognize today, but that was started a little earlier. So this I would consider the sprouting phase, whereby humanistic Buddhism goes beyond its motherland in China, off to some neighboring countries. And then also further concretization took place in Taiwan. Specifically, I'm going to talk about these three important figures, Xingyun, Shengyan, and Zhengyan. So I will briefly talk about them in the next phase, and eventually focus on what I'm familiar with in Foguangshan. So phase 3 is what I call the flowering of transnational humanistic Buddhism. So now we see humanistic Buddhism blossoming in many countries around the world. It's a time when we see a development of mass humanistic Buddhism organizations such as Foguangshan, Dharma Drum, and Chiji. These are not the only HB organizations. There are many. It's just that these three are a little bit more visible than the others. And thanks to the Chinese diaspora, we see actual border crossings. We also see a form of socially engaged modern religiosity. So let's start with answering the question of what are the characteristics of humanistic Buddhism that we see today. And you can then maybe compare back with the humanistic Buddhism from 2 phases ago. In terms of some characteristics of humanistic Buddhism today, doctrinally, we see it as being construed as HB as a recovery or return to or revival of the Buddha's original teachings. So it says, that humanistic Buddhism is still Buddhism. It's not departing from the original intents of the Buddha. So the Buddha comes first. You also see that a number of the humanistic Buddhist organizations today refer to the Ekotarika Agama that talks about Buddha obtaining enlightenment in the human realm, that he's born in the human realm, he lived in the human realm, and he got enlightened in the human realm. Is there a reason why? For everyone online, just give us a minute. We are going to figure out why the screen
just went blank. Let's try this.
Did the TV turn off?
I did.
Yeah.
Oops. Screen share has stopped because fine. I'm going to share screen again.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. I'm sorry. It must be I've spoken too long, and it's saying that it's time to stop. Can I carry on? Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So you notice that there's always a mention of Pure Land, but in humanistic Buddhism, the emphasis is on Pure Land on earth, the Pure Land here, rather than the Western Pure Lands, which was the Pure Land of Chinese Buddhism, the Western Pure Land of being reborn into a different cosmic Pure Land. So here's the difference. So the humanistic Pure Land here on earth, and the justification for that is the Mahayana Bodhisattva path, and always that emphasis on generosity, because that's the first of the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva path. So these are some of the doctrinal bases of the humanistic Buddhism of today that you find quite common across the various schools. Then, in terms of practice, we see a steering away from the funerary rites, and that was, of course, the Taishi's emphasis as well from the very beginning, that Buddhism shouldn't be limited to funerary rites. It should be here, it should be in the here and the now, and that there's a claim that the transformation should take place according to the situation while preserving the core Buddhist Dharmic principles. So that's called qi ji qi li, meaning that it's according to the situation, so upaya, and still preserving Dharma according to the intents of the Buddha. There is also saying that the practice is based on the theory of otherworldly attitude for a secular setting, right? There's also an integration of traditional culture and modern ideals. So, for example, you'll find that most of the humanistic Buddhist organizations of today adopt technology. Here I am using Zoom. I'm using PowerPoints, and many of them use generative AI to do translations. Yes, these are the days. And there's also an attempt at globalization, and beyond that, also glocalization. For example, like what we're doing here in Australia. And really a big emphasis on education. You see that institution after institution, the big emphasis on education, and that's shared from the time of Taixu, Cihang, Yingshun, and all the way to today. And the education emphasizes not just monastic education, but also education for laity. So what are some case studies? I'll just briefly mention a few. Of course, my emphasis will probably be more on Fo Guangshan because of my familiarity, but I don't want to ignore Dharma Drum and Chiji as well, because some of you may belong to these organizations, but on top of that is that they are very important landmarks of humanistic Buddhism. So Chiji, Compassionate Relief Merit Society, was founded by Master Zheng Yan in 1966. It is currently the largest Buddhist organization in Taiwan and has 5 million followers worldwide. Its main activities centered around charity, humanitarian aid, and hospital work. And its focus is more on compassion in action, and you'll find a very strong female involvement in the kind of work that they do: social welfare, disaster relief, environmental conservation. Dharma Drum. Dharma Drum estimated around 1.5 million devotees worldwide, founded by Master Sheng Yan in 1989. And the emphasis is mainly in education, so that's important again, and Chan practice. So deeply inspired by Tai Hsu's Buddhist educational reform. So we see that a lot of what Dharma Drum does is focus is on education, and in particular, its meditative practices. It also has a fair bit of Western followers who take on the meditation side of their program and also the education side. So here's a little bit of the poster in Chinese is about environmental conservation. Now, I'm going to focus in on Fo Guangshan. Fo Guang means Buddha's light. Shan means mountain. Founded in 1967 with headquarters in Kaohsiung. And so Fo Guangshan is the monastic arm, and its lay arm is called the Buddhist Light International Association, which has a lot of chapters around the world. I want to highlight in order to return to my theme of compassion and integrating it with engagement, I want to highlight this particular project. So there is a particular project in Brazil called the Sons of the Tathagata. The Sons of the Tathagata. It came about because of Venerable Jue Cheng, who was assigned to the Brazil temple. And she was there for 16 years. She's now the head abbess overseeing Malaysia, Singapore, I think India, and Indonesia. And when she was first in Brazil, she was charged with the construction of the Rulai temple, the Tathagata temple. And there she was robbed many times, apparently like 6 times. And many of these times with guns on a temple. But at the time, she was very calm. She just vowed to herself, and she said that I may not be able to save you, but I want to save your children. And so what did she do? She picked up the children from the streets of Brazil, carried them back to the Rulai temple, fed them, educated them, gave them a place where they could play sports in a safe ground, taking them away from the mobs, away from the ghettos, giving them a life. Now, they love to play soccer, right? Football is the Brazilian sport. So they could do that also within the temple. And she trained them. She had coaches come to train them. And then they got sent to play football around the world. I'm going to come back to this thing in a little while. But in Fo Guangshan, some of you may know, we have a university consortium because the Venerable Master also believes very much in education. We're probably one of the few Buddhist organizations in the world that has a consortium of tertiary institutions. We have monastic education, but at the same time, there are also tertiary secular institutions. So Nantian Institute is just one of many around the world, in America, in Taiwan, and in the Philippines. One of those institutions is called Nanhua University in Taiwan. Why I want to raise that is, as the kids in the Sons of the Tathagata project grew older into university going age, the kids have an opportunity to be sent to Nanhua University in Taiwan, where they could continue their tertiary education. They could still be playing football, representing Nanhua, but at the same time receiving the education they need for social mobility. Venerable Jue Cheng's vow was answered. She vowed to save the children. She did. So now these children had a new lease of life. And I believe that's the intention of humanistic Buddhism. The humanistic Buddhism is the goal of it, through compassion, not being fearful of the dreadful situations where we started, drawing nourishment from the mud, from the ground, and then growing from that mud in order to shine in the world. Not for ourselves, really, but for the society. Because with these group of young kids, you know that Brazil will have a future. And that's what's happening. That's the reason why the master would invest so much money into education. Nantian Institute is a big black hole, right? So it's a lot of money for higher ed, but the master sees it as a way to transform society. So that leads me to the fruiting phase. So if you look at the flowering phase as the phase whereby transnationalism, so sowing the seeds in very many countries, then after that, it's really about how we face the world as we go out. So I see two things happening. One is that transnational humanistic Buddhism shapes the places they go to, but also are being shaped by the places they go to. And we also see that where the humanistic Buddhism roots are sown, the seeds are sown, they have to face the new worlds and reinvent itself. So that's why I like the metaphor of the fruit, because it's sort of like you're wrapping up all the goodness of the flower, taking in all the sunshine and all, maturing, but at the same time, it bears the seeds for another new lease of life. So, in order to look at how transnational humanistic Buddhism shaped and been reshaped by contemporary society, one of the things I tried to do, and I really haven't done a very good job yet, all I've managed to do in the little time that I have the last couple of days was to put together a timeline of Venerable Master Xing Yun's writings. If anyone wants to take this and do further study, I highly very happy to share this timeline with you with a lot more details. But what I did was I tried to look at every decade, what did Venerable Master Xing Yun write? And using that, I could see the pattern of how things changed and how the seeds were sown. So initially in the 1950s, the Venerable Master translated from Japanese, the Universal Gate chapter on Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, because it was a very popular chanting book. So there was a commentary, which he then translated for everyone else to read. He also wrote two very successful books, actually more than this, but two that were very successful: biography of the Shakyamuni Buddha especially, and the biography of the Buddha's 10 disciples. So you see, it started with getting to know the Buddha, right? Getting to know the Buddha and his Sangha. But he also, interestingly, actually lectured, which then turned into his note and to a publication, is Buddhist perspective on wealth. You would think that Buddhists take a vow of poverty, but yet, at that time, the 1950s, guess what was happening in Taiwan? He was in Taiwan at this time. What's happening? They were growing, right? So people were actually quite looking forward to ways to make money. So what's the Buddhist perspective on wealth? So actually knowing what people were interested in and writing for people. 1960s, he started to travel, and so we see a fair bit of his travelogues. And throughout this time, he was still giving a lot of lectures wherever he goes because he traveled. So wherever he go, there were lots of lectures, and so these were collected and printed. In the 1980s, you see, there was a collection around Xing Yun Chan talks. Humanistic Buddhism of Venerable Master Xing Yun was based on the Chan school because of his lineage. So you naturally see that he started with Chan talks. What were some of the Chan teachings? But come 1990s, which is very recent, he started writing short verses and short pages. So instead of a whole novel, it moved into just short, very short phrases and short passages, 1 or 2 pages. Because why? By the 1990s, people were busy. All these Chinese businessmen, right? They're all very busy out there. They don't have time for a whole novel anymore. Short and sweet, but to the point. And you would start seeing Dharma words, start seeing these 100 sayings, things getting more compressed. He also started publishing his diaries from the early days because he was getting famous. People wanted to know what made a great master. He started publishing his own diaries. Over time, he published more and more. He was actually busier and busier, but he did more and more. And if you look at the title of what he was publishing, The Philosophy of Being Second, he was teaching people how to deal with the difficulties in a busy life, how to deal with the world around them. But at the same time, he didn't stop his sutra commentary. So he now is no longer translating, he's giving his own commentaries. Most of his work is around the Mahayana sutras. Then there's a whole bunch in the 2000s, the turn of the millennium. We see him publishing things that are going to be helpful for people who are stressed out. So they have prayers for different occasions. He writes about happiness. For all living beings, won many prizes, awards around the world. And it's actually the 3 trainings of morality or ethics or discipline and meditative concentration and wisdom. So it's basic, back to the basic teachings, but short passages. He didn't forget his Chan poems and his sutra commentaries as well. But in the 2000s, we started publishing textbooks. Why? Because of all the educational institutions that are being established. So he started putting out textbooks to standardize and systematize all these teachings around the world. So these books were published also for the various BLI, the Buddhist Light International Association, to use in their study groups. So there were standard materials that were used. Again, a lot of work around still lessons on wealth, on wisdom, on success, but never forgetting honesty and kindness. We've published this 366 days with wisdom as well as 365 days. So these are books where every day there are some wisdom passages. So you notice from here then in the 2010s started this emphasis on humanistic Buddhism. So it was only in the 21st century, even though the seeds were so much earlier, that this emphasis on humanistic Buddhism, the term humanistic Buddhism started. But seeds were sown much earlier. I think he's one of the living masters that I know of who directed and completed his own complete works while he was alive. He probably didn't trust us as his disciples to be able to do a good job and understand what he wanted. So there were 395 volumes. I mean, writing one book, and I don't want to do another one already. Here's somebody who did 395, and he divided them into 12 categories and over 30 million Chinese characters. But if you look at the categories, the first category of these 395 words are the sutras and the commentaries. So we can see that humanistic Buddhism emphasizes the Buddhist teachings. So Buddha's sutras and the sages' commentaries come first. Second category are all the essays around humanistic Buddhism, and then the rest follow. So 12 categories altogether. I didn't list all of them down. I only listed the first few. Yeah. I talk about this as fruiting because I see that the work that has been done in humanistic Buddhism, not just in Fo Guangshan, but actually around the world, and by all the other organizations, as bearing fruit now, because there are more and more research around humanistic Buddhism. I'll talk about that in a little while. But within Fo Guangshan alone, we have that many research centers that have been established around the world, all working collaboratively on areas related to, not exclusively, on humanistic Buddhism. So we see that there is, and this is only in Fo Guangshan, and all the other like Dharma, Dram, and Chi and all the others also have their own research centers, some of which also focus on research in humanistic Buddhism. So I want to talk about Nantian Institute because this talk really helped me to contextualize what is it that we are doing in Nantian, especially at Humanistic Buddhism Center. So thank you so much, Mark, for the opportunity. Because it gave us an opportunity, and thanks to Xiaoyang for pulling this together for me into this timeline, looking at humanistic Buddhism beyond China and Taiwan into Australia, especially here in Australia, we see that Buddhism, or rather Chinese Buddhism, and some of the major Buddhist milestones started as early as 1977. But I want to, and we were talking about Unibuds, 1980s, Tina. So these were establishment of much of the seeds. Nantian Temple really only came here in the 1990s, but it was in 2015 when Nantian Institute was established as a separate building. And 2018, we had that bridge linking the sacred space, the practice space of the temple, and the study space connecting East and West, and allowing this institute to have an umbilical cord to our temple. But what the Humanistic Buddhism Center was really trying to do was to say, okay, how did this phenomenon really come about? It was not an isolated piece. So that was when we started the Journal on Studies on Humanistic Buddhism, trying to look at first what were the foundational thoughts and what are some of the practical applications, how globalization took place. So given it's humanistic Buddhism, it's about human life, and we've just published something on humanistic Chan Buddhism. So every year, on average, thereabouts. And we do have a website where we collected, initially was translated articles, but now we have a fair bit of original publications as well. So here we have an opportunity to collect. And we say that this journal really serves as an incubator for research in humanistic Buddhism. About the same time we started the journal, we also started collecting a bibliography of anything to do with humanistic Buddhism and engaged Buddhism and applied Buddhism. And to date, we have collected a bibliography of over 1,200 publications. Yeah. And we noticed that every year it grew faster and faster. So which means that there is more and more original research in English on the topic of humanistic Buddhism or engaged Buddhism or both. And the reason we do this is that although Google can return you a lot of information, you really don't know whether it's reliable or not. And with ChatGPT, you really don't know. So that's why we maintain this publication bibliography. But it's very hard to read the bibliography and hard to use. So we have built also a visualizer. And what was interesting was we used the visualizer for many things. But one of the things we did was we looked at the humanistic Buddhism. We tried to compare. If you look at the dots, the dots means bigger dots means more articles and smaller dots means fewer articles for that keyword. So we look at the time period, the first from 2001 to 2010, and the next time period from 2011 to 2019, you see a shift of the kinds of publications. For example, we see that there's now a shift towards Chinese. So there's more publications with the word Chinese, and education appeared as opposed to in the earlier period. So there's like more studies around Chinese Buddhism, Chinese humanistic Buddhism, and education. So even contemporary has come up as a big word. So this was like just pulling out keywords. We're also very happy to say that we've last year established a Humanistic Buddhism Special Interest Group. We've had 4 meetings to date, 3 every year. And it's really a platform for scholarly exchange. We're so happy with the variety of scholars who have come to share their scholarship in various aspects that are related to humanistic Buddhism. And we continue to welcome your research. It doesn't have to be full-fledged research. It could also be ideas. And you just want people to hear you out. Last 2 years ago now, it was end of 2022. Yes, when we published a special issue on Buddhism in the Sea of Islands. The reason we do this is because we wanted to look at the flows and counterflows. It's very much like humanistic Buddhism. So Buddhism has just flows into here, into Australia, New Zealand, the Sea of Islands, but also there are counterflows back. So Xiaoyang and I was investigating the flows of innovation through the Buddhist birthday festivals, one of the larger investments that we make here in Australia to attract people to come to know more about the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And we had the opportunity in this particular special issue to work together with our colleagues in Deakin University and Western Sydney University. We are now starting, and we're very happy to announce that we are now starting also on a project, a 3-year project in Buddhism in Australia, well-being, belonging, and engagement. This is an opportunity for us to find out more about humanistic Buddhism and its place in Australia, because I think it has matured to a certain area, but how is it integrated? So here is an opportunity for us to find out by looking at Buddhism in Australia at large and determining whether we have a little place in there. As in the theme of this talk is about compassion, and it's what's important to us in humanistic Buddhism. So last year we published this book, Cultivating Compassion. Some of our authors are here, our contributors to this edited volume are here. So we're very happy that we have an opportunity also to look at one aspect of humanistic Buddhism around compassion. One of the chapters in this book proposes the idea of meta-verses. And why is meta-verses important to us? Because the Venerable Master Xing Yun, the founder of the Fo Guangshan Humanistic Buddhism, wrote this particular gatha. And it started with, may kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, which are the 4 immeasurables, may they pervade all worlds. So what does kindness pervading all worlds mean? Well, it means multi-verses of metta. So since promoting or proposing this concept in the book that I mentioned earlier, I've had the opportunity to speak in Italy, in Eindhoven, and also at Meta Convention on this concept of metaverses. And very soon we'll be embarking on a project. The communities of practice, some of you are familiar with, is also an opportunity for us to take humanistic Buddhism facing the world, facing the community, and exploring different humanistic values and what they mean. So it's an outreach arm of the center. In addition, at the Nantian Institute, we have kind of pioneered the first in the world graduate certificate and accredited certificate in humanistic Buddhism, in the study of humanistic Buddhism. So that's again kind of the fruiting phase. There's come to a point whereby humanistic Buddhism, we could look at what it is, but more importantly, is reshaping it for the future, together with teachers and students, together with the community, to sow the seeds for a humanistic Buddhism that's relevant to the modern society and not getting stuck with what was in the original definition of humanistic Buddhism. And we hope that Nantian Institute would be the place to do so and to encourage more people onto, going into this yana is the availability of scholarships. So we've come almost on time to the conclusion and summary. We've made it this far. I started off by looking at what is humanistic Buddhism. So I hope that this particular journey has impressed upon you that humanistic Buddhism is not monolithic, it's not static, it's not cast in gold yet. It is really being shaped. It currently is just an overarching label that identifies several different interpretations, Buddhist doctrines and practices. There are some shared vocabulary among these groups, but at the same time, we're also diversifying. It's a practice. Some people call it a Dharma gate. Some people call it even a tradition. Not sure yet, but this is what's happening. And the proposed phases that I've put together essentially shows how in the initial days, why it emerged. It emerged as a way to kind of save the nation, to rescue China of the time as it was reforming, as the country went from its imperialistic past into a republican future. It was trying to create a new China, so-called new China of the time, and Buddhism was trying to find its place. So that was the humanistic Buddhist response, which is one of several responses. And from there, there was a sprouting phase outside of China, and it was fortunate that sprouting took place because within China was really difficult. The communist regime wouldn't have allowed that to happen so rapidly. So outside in Taiwan and Southeast Asia, we see the roots of humanistic Buddhism sprouting. And then onto the flowering phase, whereby there's this transnational movements. And what I see now is the establishment of Buddhist institutes to look back over these few phases and encapsulating that development in preparation for, and at the same time for facing that modern world, and therefore that final global modern kind of phase. So here is that horticultural metaphor for which I would be happy to receive feedback as to whether that's relevant or not, or any parts. I'm a practitioner of non-self, so that's perfectly fine. You tear any bits of this down and tell me that it's wrong. I will be very happy. You don't have to be especially polite, but in fact, that's your gift to me with your questions and your comments. With that, I thank you, and I'm going to stop share and return the floor to Mark.
So Thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk. I'm going to do this.
52. Oh my goodness.
52, very good. I would like to start the questions off, which is, so you here in this very last slide, you identify, it starts in China, mainland China. But most of your talk and most of what you seem to present as humanistic Buddhism centers on Taiwanese groups.
Yes.
So, Dharma Drum, Guanshan, Tzu Chi, is it?
Yes.
Yep. Master Xing Yun.
Yes. Who is Chinese,
but he based in his
Taiwan.
temple in Taiwan is
His headquarters is Guangshan in Taiwan.
Okay. What happened in China? So is it, so you're talking really, it's Taiwanese phenomenon.
Yes.
Yep, that has really flourished and spread.
Yes.
In China?
Yes.
What's happening?
In China, actually.
You look at this.
I'm going to share this little webcam here. So in China, actually, there's a lot that has been happening in the recent years.
Mm-hmm.
I must say that there was an article by Stephanie Travagnin, who has explored the development of humanistic Buddhism specifically to China.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if she's online. I invited her. If she is, I must welcome her to speak instead, because I actually borrowed a lot from her article. Okay, so no, she's not online. But what I feel is that in China, especially with the recognition, there's this, what is it called? The Buddhist Association of China. The Buddhist Association now puts humanistic Buddhism as a recognized label. So which means that many Chinese temples now classify themselves under humanistic Buddhism, under the banner of humanistic Buddhism. And that's very interesting. So we also see that these temples are branching outwards. Some of them establishing temples here in Australia.
From China.
From China. So that's why I see that as a possible kind of metaphor that also applies to these Chinese organizations. Yes. Xiaoyang, do you have anything to add to that? She helped me with a fair bit of my research, and we read the same paper.
No, not really. I think one figure to mention probably is Zhao Fuchu, who was the president of the Chinese Buddhist Association, and he was one of the people who really put humanistic Buddhism on the map in terms of what its position is in Chinese Buddhism.
So it's endorsed now.
Okay. Yep.
Which is important.
Yep. But it sounds a little bit like some Buddhist groups in China are sheltering under the umbrella of the name because that's recognized, or they are genuinely humanistic Buddhist in their orientation.
I think they are starting to adopt this. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, Venerable Master Xing Yun started offering Dharma lineage endorsements, and many of these Chinese monks were endorsed as the Dharma heirs of Venerable Master Xing Yun. Thereby, they have the Dharma rights to promote humanistic Buddhism.
Okay. Okay. Does somebody else in the room will come to the online? Please first. Yourself.
Yeah. Shall I talk from here?
You talk from there, and I will repeat the question if you.
Well, I think we'll do it for the presentation. I go back to the concept of the conundrum early in the talk, and also your reference to discussing the appropriateness of humanistic as the terminology. And I say that because I just wonder whether humanistic Buddhism is a bit human exceptional. In other words, it's focusing on a species without acknowledgement of other species. And I say that because back in my chapter in that volume that you referred to, I summarize the ecological history of Buddhism. And so Buddhism initially, at the time of the Buddha, and also in China, I would say, with Confucianism and Taoism and Zen, they're frequently, and Pure Land Buddhism, they're set in the natural world. And so there's less exceptionalism of the human. And we know nowadays that we are a real curse because we have denied our reliance and our very nature on the world around us. And I think your use of the horticultural metaphor it emphasizes that you're using another species and the behavior of that other species to relate to our need and our dependence on these other species. Otherwise, we will all become extinct non-entities. I just wonder what you think about.
Joey, can you repeat the question very briefly?
Well, just one word: transhumanistic. Would be, what I'm really referring to, beyond the human and welcoming all the other species.
So the question from Jonathan Page here in the room is around the word humanistic Buddhism and whether that is an overemphasis on humans aspect, the anthropogenic aspect. Especially we know in the Anthropocene, and today we are aware of the damage that the human has done to the world. When I was talking about the conundrum, I also mentioned how we were not very happy with the word humanistic. We were stuck with it. So we tried to explain that it is about for the human realm. So it's Buddhist teachings for the human realm. And the human realm mustn't forget the animals and the plants in the world that we live in and the bigger cosmos as well, all the beings, visible and invisible. So it's for the human realm. It doesn't mean that we are only focused on the human. So I guess it's more, we are stuck with that humanistic Buddhism. So I guess it's in the subtitle where we can express. And then, of course, give an occasion, an opportunity for questions like that to clarify.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ian,
yeah.
You had a question?
Hi, thank you for your talk, Venerable.
Hi, Ian.
I've heard some of this before, of course. You asked for feedback.
Yes, please.
I'm just going to give you 4 quick responses.
Write this down.
Okay, you most of all asked for feedback on the metaphor of
Yes.
growth.
Yes.
So I just happen to have a book here, Metaphors We Live By.
Oh,
About
wow.
the cognitive process metaphor. Okay, so you are formulating a metaphor. Religion is a plant. Okay, so this is what you have to work with, I suppose. Most metaphors are partial, so they won't work in every context. Like you don't do plant food to religion, right? So, but anyway, just having a metaphor alone is not enough for scholarship. It's a very interesting area because our cognition uses metaphors. So I suppose if you want to spread HP, I guess that's what you're doing here, and you should think about this. You also mentioned colonial hegemony. Actually, the colonial powers never had hegemony. And one of the interesting things about the early 20th century is that the Japanese were very effective in North China, and that they failed to spread their own version of Buddhism, which is all the more astonishing because it used Chinese texts, right? It had the same canon as the Chinese. So I think it's very interesting to bear in mind that there was already a Sinophone Buddhism that was tied to modernity in the formative years of humanistic Buddhism, which just completely failed to connect with the Chinese for whatever reason, I guess ethno-nationalistic reasons. Okay, so I think hegemony is just a kind of strong word. Actually, the Japanese proved that European control over Asia was actually just incredibly weak. They could just ride down on bicycles from Malaya and just shoot everyone up in 7 days. That was it. The end of European power in Southeast Asia. Vimalakirti, which Venerable Yanpei cited as a source of humanistic Buddhism, is a very interesting text. But what's interesting about that is that the protagonist of Vimalakirti is not a monastic and not a bodhisattva. He's a layperson, right? So Vimalakirti has more than the bodhisattva ideal. He has reality, right? He has a direct connection to reality. So I think if that's the ideal of humanistic Buddhism, reality has to be the thing that interests you. I mean, if you have a Centre for Humanistic Buddhism that just studies humanistic Buddhism, it's like if Sydney Uni just studies Sydney. I think you should broaden your focus a little bit. And I have similar sort of points to make about the name humanistic, Jonathan. Like Renmin would just be, human, the Buddhism of the human, as opposed to the Buddhism of the ghosts, whatever. I think you should consider a free translation like social Buddhism, right? Because you're really interested in human society, ultimately. And I think Jonathan's points perhaps were aimed at addressing this kind of awkwardness surrounding the word humanistic in English. Okay, I know there's a lot of branding tied up with this, but whenever we outside the tradition hear this, it makes us wonder, what's humanistic about this? So it's really a bit of an important topic. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll have to do that.
Flavio.
Yes, just that reference to the humanistic I find interesting. I wonder also whether there is historically maybe a little bit of a blind spot about this very early phase, the seed phase. I'm not sure that how much of this was Western. What's the guy's name? Tai Shi?
Tai Shi.
Tai Shi. I wonder how much Western influence was in his thinking as well. So I would have liked a little bit more about this aspect. I'm not entirely certain.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there is a tension between West and East. And I think it comes from the term humanistic. And because when I look at like the humanistic Buddhism as it is defined there, it's very similar to what the Protestants were trying to do in the West.
Yeah.
Be identical.
That's right.
They had the same issue, right?
Yes.
So I think historically, I would add this one layer where now, in a way, you're spreading this wonderful message and you're becoming global, but it doesn't start with the heartland China. It starts already in a dialogue with the larger world. And there was probably stuff going on with the Westerns and maybe this type of colonialism or imperialism was less political than intellectual, possibly. I'm not certain because the Europeans are very advanced in studying Buddhism at this point.
Yeah.
More so than the Chinese, most likely at this point.
There was a lot of exchange. Yeah. And I remember there was an article also around humanistic Buddhism and Protestant Christianity, and even considering humanistic Buddhism as a Protestant Buddhism. So that's right. So yes, thank you. But the term humanistic Buddhism, humanistic, has gone through so much. Many of us don't like it, but we're stuck with it. So I think what it is adding that paragraph around it to say what it is. Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. The Venerable Master Xing Yun has always promoted it because of the layperson part. He sees that the BLIA and the Fo Guangshan are two wings of a bird, and that the layperson is extremely important. And he often promoted the Vimalakirti Sutra to encourage the lay people. See that they can be just as enlightened in the reality, right? This whole study, they can just do as much as a lay person, and there's so much value. Yeah, but thank you for all that. Yes.
Let's just see.
There's so many questions here.
Some questions online.
Would
you like to answer some of them?
Okay. How do I think maybe expand this. Will that be easier?
You click up the top there.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. How can we introduce humanistic Buddhism to a society where the concept of Buddhism is still the same? Old, where
Same.
Buddhists, the same old one, still same old one, where the Buddhists are living on mountains and come down only to get food. Can we introduce lots of upaya? Anybody has any idea?
Well, first of all, is that a true characterization? I don't think it is it?
Where the concept of Buddhism is the same old one.
Where Buddhists are living on mountains come down, that's, I don't know, it doesn't quite strike an accord with modern forms of Buddhism that I'm aware of.
Well, Venerable, I think you're answering it by who you are. I mean, look at you. You're not in the mountain coming down just for food. Right?
I thought that would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. But you're very engaged. And maybe the way that we show people, maybe the way to correct that view is by people like yourself and the monastics coming out and being in society and doing work for the community.
I'm really surprised if people have that kind of worldview, because if you go on YouTube, you go on any of these places, you see a different kind of Buddhism today. Yeah. In fact, it's too many Dharma talks out there. Okay, maybe moving on.
Anna Halof, you were asking about who was speaking. Well, one of the last speakers was Flavia, who you have met, our new Tibetan lecturer. Ian was speaking before. Paul, is it?
Jonathan.
Okay. We'll try and identify people if I know them, or maybe the speakers can identify themselves. Yep.
Thank you. So there's a question here from someone who is part of the Buddha Dharma Association in Brazil. The terms engaged Buddhism and humanistic Buddhism, can they be used as synonyms, or is the first term a form of appropriation from humanistic Buddhism? This is another age-old question. I know.
That's an interesting one, because
there's so many papers.
But the way the sort of ideas that are being presented here about challenging or questioning the use of the word humanistic, it's almost as though engaged, which maybe that's a better description of what you are. I mean, it seems as though what characterizes this movement, as you articulated, is an engagement with society.
Yeah.
And this is now Buddhism's always been involved in that to a certain extent. But what we see, particularly in the more modern period, is, in Sri Lanka, Burma, and whatever, Buddhata in Thailand, where you can't practice in Buddhism unless you have a certain standard of living. So you improve the standard of living of people, the material well-being of people. Right? There seems to be a similarity between them.
Yeah, that's right. There are so much overlaps between the two groups. For example, there is a paper that said how Thich Nhat Hanh was influenced by what Master Tai Chi has taught. I think when people started this, they give it a label, right? So we are now respecting the roots of Master Tai Chi, who says that it is Buddhism in the human realm, Buddhism for the human realm, and there's the human in there. So we are trying to keep that in the translation to show that quote unquote tradition. But it is a form of Buddhism that we recognize as being engaged in society. Right. So, but the two groups are quite different, though, at this point. So there's socially engaged Buddhism, the Sulak Savarshika's group, and then there is, of course, the Thich Nhat Hanh's group, and many others around the socially engaged Buddhism movements. And there are papers around the differences between the two and the similarities as well.
Do we have any other questions in the room?
Appropriation. I wouldn't use the word appropriation at this point. Now I
Other
move on to the
questions
next
there? Yep.
question. Humans are from Andy, humans are very prone to making mistakes and being mischievous. Oh, therefore, how does Buddhism in and for humans cope with such difficult subjects? Well, that's human, right? It's our human condition, and we acknowledge it. So I suspect humanistic Buddhism must reshape itself to constantly meet evolving human subjects. Well, you've just answered your question. I often ask myself, how religious is humanistic Buddhism when it strives to be more humanistic than religious? Is humanistic Buddhism slowly dissolving into society, or is it inviting human behavior to help mold itself into the avatar of humanism? Interesting. I think my conundrum is that Nantian Institute is so good, so philosophy learning, so into the original teaching of Lord Buddha, that it is confusing to match Buddhism in the Institute with Buddhism in ritual and incense burning religion. Maybe my issue is just about the word Buddhism or humanistic. Maybe it's even time to call it New Age Buddhism. Oh no. I don't think we want to identify humanistic Buddhism as New Age Buddhism. And that's the reason why you notice that from Tai Shi all the way to Xingyun and all the other humanistic Buddhist founders, that they always focus on back to the Buddha Dharma. It's always back to the teachings of Buddha. And you mentioned about the rituals. I think the rituals are very much related to customs. So the customs of, say, for example, the Chinese, the Thais, the Asian customs may be a certain way of practice. Perhaps say in the West is meditation, for example, as the kind of practice that's relevant. So rituals, I don't think there's anything wrong with rituals. In fact, rituals help ground us in many ways. So I don't believe there's anything wrong with Buddhism. I think we have to acknowledge that it is Buddhism. And of course, in Nantian Institute, the teachings is around learning, it's around the intellect. But I don't think it's separate from the practice, which is why in Nantian Institute, we also practice contemplative pedagogy to embody the teachings and to internalize the teachings and to reflect on the teachings. I mean, in the end, it is to be a better human, isn't it? So back to your original thought about humans, so that yes, we are prone to making mistakes. Yes, we are prone to being mischievous, but we are also prone to become better, a better and better version of ourselves, which is what this whole idea about compassion and integrating with society is, that the Dharma is here so that we can transform ourselves to become better. That's why we spend the effort to learn the Dharma, whatever the label is.
Do we have any more hands? Can you reduce that?
Okay. Can I reduce that?
Just so we can see if there's any hands online. Any other questions here? Okay.
Just for the humanistic word, just coming back to that, in Chinese, would you say that it's also in Chinese play on words in Chinese as well, with ren, like ren qi, etc. And so when it's translated into English humanistic, that deep meaning isn't necessarily translated through.
Yeah.
And so that's why there is that confusion when people hear it and they're not aware about the root. If someone is Chinese and they understand the word.
Yeah. Any translation releases something in the process.
Yeah.
You can't help it.
Yeah. So perhaps the people who came up with that initially in Chinese didn't think that it would be an issue, but it was something that was very deep in its meaning actually in Chinese.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Tina. Tina was just saying that perhaps in the translation process, the meaning, the original meaning of the human aspect might have been lost. Okay.
So maybe I just share something as well. Like, is it because like humanistic Buddhism is actually about how we apply the principle into our daily life.
Yes.
Because like people might think that a ritual is like, let's say, when the bell starts ringing or the gong starts, everyone sit down, meditation, that is like ritual.
Yeah.
But then for humanistic Buddhism, is because when you sweep the floor, when you chop the veggies and all that, it's actually a practice of stillness as well. So how our mind works, how we apply it into our daily life.
Yeah.
So that's why could that be why it's called humanistic Buddhism? Is because we are trying not to be 9 to 10 o'clock into the ritual for meditation.
That's right.
But it's more like how you do your state of mind for the whole day.
That's right. That's right. And that includes our attitude towards the plants, towards animals, towards the universe of beings. At all times, our attitude, the human attitude.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should come to an end. Thank you for your great talk. Very interesting and informative. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone online. Wait. Yes, yes. Maybe we do a gallery view.
I've pinned you, so I'll just.
Oh, you pinned me. No wonder I was so big.
No, because we.
Okay.
There you go. But also see inside, like, this, if you add another space,
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.